So this is really what's happening. We're starting to see how society is dissolving, basically fracturing, and that's why it's so important to have nice civil conversations and less polarization than we have today.
Okay, so you're seeing a direct correlation between the extreme climate impacts and these environmental issues on some of the other crises, mental health, substance use disorders, homelessness. Maybe, can you connect those dots for us?
Sure.
Welcome back to another episode of The Crisis Storm, where we're talking about homelessness to mental health, substance use disorders, the drug epidemic, crime, and today we're talking about a breakdown in communication in society and the polarization that compounds everything with regards to this crisis storm with Dr. Michael Mehta from Thompson Rivers University. I'll let Michael introduce himself a little bit more. Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
Awesome.
Really important topics for sure. I mean, one of the things that I've learned throughout my 30-plus year career is that although we think of these things as separate, they aren't. They are completely interconnected. And it'd be great if we can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to. Let's start, Michael, with maybe you can give us a little bit of your background as it relates to this quite broad topic of, crisis storm in community, in society.
Sure. Well, I'm a social scientist by training. I started off in the sciences, biology and chemistry, but I quickly changed gears and moved into psychology, sociology, environmental studies, and environmental policy. So I've been focusing primarily on what we call risk issues, a wide range of environmental and health risk issues. Environmentally, I've looked at things like nuclear power plant safety, for example, climate change. In terms of human health, blood safety, endocrine modulating chemicals in the environments from plastics, Wi-Fi and cellular telephone risks, and very recently, for the past 12, 13 years, air pollution from wildfires and other sources. So I look at a lot of these different kinds of things, and I think the advantage of being able to do that, and the privilege of being able to do that, is that you get a very sort of long view of what's been happening historically as well.
Now, I know I had a whole sort of broad list of maybe topics that we would discuss, but when you responded back to me, the words that you used, I gotta look at my notes here because I found this really, really interesting. When you responded back to me, you said, yeah, that sounds great to talk about all those things, and perhaps we can also talk about connecting the dots between the overall crisis and its environmental antecedents, and how they, have transformed society into a risk society. I think this is a great place to start.
Sure.
Maybe first, you can explain all of that for me.
Okay, I'll do my best. So if you look at the history of all civilizations, especially some of the bigger, better documented ones going back thousands of years, it's clear that most of these civilizations have failed because of environmental issues, either food security shortages, challenges with toxins in their water supply, or something like that. We tend not to think of it that way. We tend to think of it as a leadership failure or something similar to that. But really the two are connected. The leadership failures are usually the result of not navigating those issues properly. And if you look at many of the world's major conflicts as well, especially in the 20th century, they've often been over land territory, which is a proxy kind of way of saying resources like water and access to land and agriculture and the like. So it's clear then that all of the major conflicts that we're facing, including today, are due to these kinds of things. And I think what's happening is we're really shifting away from a society that's about distributing goods and commodities per se. There's still a lot of that, obviously, in later capitalism, to a society that is more interested in shifting, transferring, trading risk. And that's what we're doing on a global scale. Whenever we produce risk in our country, for example, with the wildfires that we've had here in the interior this year and in other years, that creation of risk and the failure to manage those risks results in risks that are being transferred to other parts of the world. We know that smoke, that pollution can travel thousands of kilometers and can create all kinds of externalities. So this is really what's happening. We're starting to see how society is dissolving, basically fracturing. And that's why it's so important to have nice civil conversations and less polarization than we have today.
Okay. So you're seeing a direct correlation between the extreme climate impacts and in these environmental issues on some of the other crises, mental health, substance use disorders, homelessness. Maybe can you connect those dots for us?
Sure.
Some, I think they might think it's a bit of a stretch.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, and that's probably because we don't normally package them that way. But I'll just give you a couple of examples. Maybe it'll make it a bit clearer. So you're probably familiar with the concept of climate change anxiety, where people, especially younger generations, feel lost and that they don't have much of a future. The reason this, of course, is happening is we've failed to manage climate change. We've known about it for more than 100 years. Many of us, especially baby boomers, have lived with it for decades, but haven't acted very well to change that direction. And the future generations are paying the price for that. They're paying it in terms of being anxious. They're paying it in terms of the transformation of the economy that's happening, and it's a bit chaotic. I can explain that in a second. In terms of their job prospects going forward. And of course, mental health is declining as a result of that. I think the biggest challenge is if you look at Canada, Canada has gone back and forth in its public policy and in other things from a resource sort of economy to a knowledge economy, and then very much back into a resource economy, leaving stranded several generations. And I see that firsthand with my students. I've been teaching since about 1990, 1991 in universities across Canada. And universities were gearing themselves to teach students for this knowledge economy, this service economy, all the new technologies and everything else. But I would say that about at the beginning of the new millennium, Canada shifted back to being a resource economy very dramatically, ignoring a lot of the environmental problems that we're now facing. And at the same time, leaving universities disconnected in terms of the training that we're offering our students from the prospects that are available in this country. Our students are still being trained by and large for a knowledge economy, but we're not moving in that direction currently, in my opinion. So this is where the disconnect is creating a lot of these problems and a lot of these kinds of manifestations of health and things like that in mental health.
Okay. So I understand a little bit more about maybe how some of these things are connected. Can you give us your sort of take on the impacts of, and I don't know if you will agree with me, but in my opinion, and it is just my opinion for the purpose of this show, in my opinion, media, we've seen a decline in fact-based journalism, a rise in citizen journalism that is not necessarily as fact-based as what we are used to with the Fifth Estate. And we've seen in the last decade a huge increase in what is known as social media. And with this, it has amplified, it has carried the voice of social discourse and of polarization. Is it cause and effect, or is it just that it's making it more accessible and that was already there?
I think there's something else that underlies all of this. It's not the technology itself, and I don't think it's the change or the shift in focus in terms of journalism that's doing this. I think it's been coming for at least 60 or 70 years, to be quite honest with you. It has to do with a decline in trust in authorities and in expertise, for good reason. As we know, a lot of people are very critical of experts, physicians, standard healthcare, of government-sponsored research, of the relationships between university, government, and industry, the patent landscape, and all those sorts of things. There's been a rapid diminishment of trust in those areas. And it's taken, I think, that long to really turn into what we're experiencing today, because obviously we now have more opportunity for it and chances to express that displeasure and distrust through these alternative media. So I really see this as the major root of the problem, and that it's also part of this risk society. This risk society is a society that is focused, it's hyper-obsessed on risk and anxiety, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Part of it is because there are risks that are simply beyond our understanding. They're of such a large scale and such a long time horizon as well, like climate change, that it's very difficult to understand them. And as a result, if you layer on top of that the distrust that I just mentioned, it's ripe for conspiracy theories and all kinds of alternative interpretations. So I think that's what's polarizing, and that's creating the problem.
Okay, well, that leads to my next question, and that is, when we have such a volume of information accessible to us today, and with that, a considerable amount of misinformation. Mm-hmm. How do we, as individuals, cope and stay informed? How do we avoid being overwhelmed with this volume of information, but still being educated and informed about what's going on?
It's the irony there, Peter, that in the past we used to say that if people simply had better information and more information, they would make better decisions, that there was a gap, right? Mm-hmm. And of course that was true to a certain extent. But now obviously there's more information out there than anybody could reasonably absorb. Mm-hmm. Millions of publications and journals every year. And of course, a lot of them not even in the languages that we speak. So this is, I think, a big part of that challenge. What I think is missing in the public discourse and at the individual level is a certain amount of wisdom, the wisdom to actually make good quality assessments of what you're hearing. And I don't blame the individuals for it. I think that, again, a lot of this has been manufactured, it's been created. There is some advantage for certain parts of society, especially those that are in power, and we know that the wealth is concentrating even more every day as we speak, to keep us confused and to not allow us to see what's happened, to not allow us to lift that veil. So this is, I think, another layer to this problem. People are well-intentioned. Most people are well-intentioned. They want to make good quality decisions. They want to understand a situation before they jump to a conclusion. Very few people are actually ideologues, in my experience. We tend to characterize them that way if we disagree with them, unfortunately. But most of it has to do with the fact that we simply don't have the filters. We don't have the wisdom, the social wisdom, to see through a lot of the stuff that's false, the narratives that are manufactured. The disinformation and the misinformation are rampant. And I see that regularly in my day-to-day work and teaching. I've worked in solar power. I work on EVs and transition to EVs. I do a lot of work on food safety and the transition to plant-based proteins and away from carnivory. The amount of misinformation and disinformation on those topics is just an epidemic. Mm. So I do see this as a big part of this overall issue.
So, as an academic leader teaching the next generation, what would you say are affable strategies that an individual could exercise to deal with this?
All right. So how do you, for lack of a better word, immunize yourself against a lot of this? Of course, we don't like to use that word too much nowadays.
Without becoming hermits or,
Yeah.
replicating what we experienced in COVID.
Right. Well, I think the most important thing for people to do is to disconnect from social media somewhat. And I think that's becoming easier nowadays in Canada, where it doesn't actually carry a lot of the main media news through it, with that a restriction on it at the moment. So I do think people are shifting, and because they can't get a lot of that information and people's interpretations of it through social media, especially Facebook or Meta as it's called now. They're going through. They're actually going to the original sources. They're reading the main media's websites. They're looking at alternative media like the Tyee and the Narwhal and things like that in BC. And the challenge with that, of course, is that local media and these kinds of media are also disappearing. And we've seen that happen in Kamloops very recently with Kamloops This Week. And of course, we had another newspaper before that as well, right? Yeah. And this is what's happening all across this country, and I'm sure elsewhere in the Western world. So how do you then get that local information to make those decisions without it going through the filter of the social media and getting distorted? Not by the media itself necessarily, but by all the people that comment on it. I see so many people, including my students, who never go beyond the headline or never go beyond the comments that are on social media and never read the actual core. We are in a rush. We're distracted. Our technology is addictive. I see it in the classroom every day, where it's a battle to get my students to look away from their phones. Some of them are actually listening to music in their headphones throughout the lecture, just to relax while I'm lecturing. I see that as problematic. I think that is going to be a major problem going forward, in that we don't have the attention spans. We don't have the ability to think critically.
Okay, well, this is a great time for a break. You've been watching The Crisis Storm, and we'll be right back after these messages.
I think first impressions are huge, and we wanted to make sure that that first impression to our captive audience was as exciting as we wanted it to be.
So we tried doing video on our own. The sound was terrible. The content was not choreographed properly, and it was a mishmash of information. So with Masterminds, we knew that we could get all the pieces of the puzzle together and get a great product.
We would watch them brainstorm in their roundtable session, and you can just see the ideas flying off of their heads. It was just so exciting to watch.
A lot of the times, we have the same ideas. It's hard to kind of get out of doing the same thing over and over again. We know what we're looking for. We know what we want. So it's always good to have an outside look at it and an outsider's perspective.
Well, they came in on roller skates. So we thought either they really know what they're doing or they're crazy.
People really like the videos that we've done. The last one in particular with the music video, there was a lot of people that were like, whoa, like that's not what we'd expect. There was lights and smoke, and you would have never thought it was a motorcycle showroom. It was crazy. It was a lot of fun.
And I think with the television commercials, they portray us as people rather than just as lawyers. And people will say, you know what, I saw that commercial and I think I could connect with you.
We've had clients call us and solicit us because of the programming they've seen on television. It works.
You can definitely tell when it's a Mastermind ad. They're just so outside the box and different than anything you ever see.
We've even had people who've seen the ad, whether on our site or on TV, call in just to say, we saw your ad, awesome ad. That's excellent.
I wonder, is it attention span, or is it an effort by some individuals to distance themselves from what they're deeming as noise?
Perhaps, but they are intentionally immersing themselves in that environment, in that noise, that complexity, because I think they're used to it. They're used to those dopamine hits, where they're constantly getting new information and different spins on things all the time. I think that's why platforms like TikTok still very popular because they do sort of cater to that shorter attention span. One of the things that I've seen also happen very dramatically in the last few years in particular is an increase in what we call accommodations at the university for our students. More and more of them having accommodations after they go through a mental health review or something similar to that for anxiety, attention deficit disorder, PTSD. I've never had students until this last couple of years bring service dogs in for PTSD into the classroom. So there is something going on, and a lot of it is the hits that people have taken from COVID, for sure. But I'm not going to just blame that pandemic. I think that this has been coming, as I've been said for decades, and it was sort of accelerated. It was like fuel thrown on that fire with the pandemic.
Now, are you suggesting that we're overcompensating to make that allowance for those individuals where we don't need to? Or are you saying that the evidence of the impacts on those individuals is rising?
It's rising.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I see it firsthand. I see the challenges that my students face. I don't think it's an over-response or that they're faking it by any means. I do think that there has been a very dramatic decline in people's mental health and well-being, and not just students. I do believe that it's very general.
So you suggested that one of the strategies is going to original sources, going back to news media, refraining a little bit more from social media. Is there any other strategy? How do we bring people together? When I think of the value of conversation in how I was raised, in community and in indigenous community, conversation, sharing of knowledge, values, having important, meaningful discussions was very important. We seem, to me, to be losing some of that. Is that part of the answer? And if so, how do we do it?
Yeah, so I think that is part of it, Peter. I do think that we've seen a decline in civic engagement in a variety of ways, not just in the traditional ways of measuring that, like declines in voter turnout, but in other ways. Less people are involved in service organizations. There's clearly a generational divide there. They're less involved in fraternal organizations. I've been a Freemason for about 35 years. We've seen quite a decline in our membership and an aging of our membership. And of course, at the same time, when you layer on top of that other things that are happening, including shifts in the way in which people see leadership and the kinds of leadership skills that they develop, it's quite dramatic. A lot of it has to do with people like Donald Trump in the U.S. I'm not going to blame him specifically. He's the manifestation of a particular culture in an extreme sense. But a lot of people now don't trust politicians. They don't trust leaders. They don't like their bosses at work. They don't trust experts, as I mentioned earlier. And a big part of this is because we've lost the ability to work together through civil society types of organizations outside of the workplace. We really don't have any idea about concepts that are really important, like servant leadership, where it's a very different approach to leadership and sharing of power rather than what we currently see in our societies, which is creating a lot of the maladies as well. So all of this is coming together, as I suggested earlier.
So I'm trying to unpack in my own mind what you just said. Are you suggesting that then the answer to people coming together is for them to find a group of people whose actions they want to emulate and for them to immerse themselves with that group?
Partly mentorship and leadership. If you want to become a better person, you surround yourself with good quality people that embody the values that you would like to have. I think that's part of it. That we've always had that historically, even in the workplace. But that has been broken. There are generational breaks as well. Very few people have exposure to people outside of their own generation. And some of that is manufactured again. Some of it's by choice. Some of it is because we don't have these opportunities because we've been disengaged. I mean, look at the decline of organizations like the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts all across North America. Look at what's happening to volunteerism. I mean, there's no doubt that there's greater need than ever before. Yet there's less and less people able to do this or wanting to do this. And part of that is because of this hyper-accelerated world that we live in. We've put ourselves onto the treadmill. We're being pulled in a million directions by all of our technology. We're looking at our phones. We're being buzzed here and there by our text messages coming in. And we're unable to be, there in the real world in real time with the people that you're with. Just go to any bar or restaurant in town. You'll see people there, probably because they want to be in a social space, sitting and staring at their cell phone and talking or buzzing and texting with people somewhere else and not communicating with anybody right there in the same room. And to me, that's broken. And I think that's a symptom of all that we've been talking about.
One part of me wants to believe that as a society, we are correcting wrongs of the past with regards to judgment of others. There's a lot more. I don't want to use the word woke because it carries both positive and negative connotations for some people, but people are much more aware of, we're being encouraged to be more tolerant of differences between people.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, and I don't know if it's because of a rise in media and social media and my attention to it, I see stories like, what I heard last week of anti-Semitism being screamed out in the streets of London, England, and bystanders just standing there absolutely shocked with what was being screamed to an individual just walking down the street. That was unknown to the person who was screaming it,
right?
Just because they were Jewish.
Yeah. And again, that's not new. Obviously, unfortunately, it's not new. But it is sort of what happens when people are under stress. When you put any organism, humans, rats, whatever they are, under stress, unnatural conditions, you end up with, unfortunately, those that are on the edge, those that are already perhaps dealing with mental health issues over that edge. And that's nothing new. And scapegoating is a big part of that, especially as mentioned earlier, the resources become less and less available. I mean, if you think of homelessness, for example, it's a classic resource issue. Availability, cost, and affordability are resource issues. The same way that now we see food inflation or foodflation making things very inaccessible for people. I just read that in parts of Ontario now, I think it was Mississauga, Ontario, near Toronto, the food banks in that area are no longer allowing international students to pick up food from the food banks because there's a shortage, and they feel that they should be responsible for their own food and their own survival. So I think this is what happens when, again, you've got these climate change constraints, these resource constraints, the shifts in economy layered on with all of the stress and anxiety that creates these problems. And when people are happy, when they're secure, when their bellies are full, they have a place to sleep, we have a much more peaceful society. There's no question about it.
How do we get back there?
I don't know if we can. Not easily. I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic, but when it comes to this particular sort of topic, I do think that there needs to be a very serious reckoning first. There has to be maybe more of an extreme collapse. I mean, as I said, with climate change, we've been talking about this for 100 years, and very much so in the last few decades. Yet for 30, 40 years now, the top-selling vehicle in North America is the Ford F-150 pickup truck. So there's a disconnect, there's a gap. People are not acting on what they know. There's what we call an attitude-behavior disjuncture. We have attitudes, but we're not acting on them appropriately. So I think the only way that that's going to be fixed is by having a complete collapse.
Dire. Is there anything that those of us that don't want to see that happen to our families, our friends, ourselves, can do about that?
Sure there is. Yeah, but it requires a change in your own behavior, and an immediate one that is sometimes difficult for people. And of course, there's a lot of social pressure against it. I mean, if we zero in on that climate change example, the 3 or 4 things that we can do to fix this problem right away are to change what we drive. That's number one. Yet look at the EV adoption rate in places like Kamloops, the interior, very, very low. We need to change our diets, stop eating meat. Very few people want to do that. We need to stop getting in the airplanes and jumping off and taking off to Mexico or wherever we want, whenever we want. Huge environmental footprint for that. People feel that they deserve it. As they get older, unfortunately, when they have the resources to make these changes, they often don't want to. They feel that their days are numbered, their years are numbered, may as well enjoy themselves, right? So this is the issue. You know, the young people are the ones that can't afford to make a lot of these transitions and changes, except for perhaps diet. When you're middle-aged and you have children, it's very difficult to do it because you have competing sort of needs. When you're older, when you have the resources, you don't do it typically because you say, well, what's the difference? I'm going to die anyway, and I may as well enjoy my last few years. No one's doing it. So yeah, we can make these changes. We can break that cycle, but it's not easy.
I don't want to get into a debate. I don't know what side of the fence I sit on, but when I hear things like, you know, we all need to drive electric vehicles. The cost of an electric vehicle today?
Equivalent now to a non-electric vehicle. There's all kinds of studies that show that the cost is equivalent. And of course, if you look at the 5-year, 10-year operating costs as well on top of that and the maintenance, you're saving money.
Right, but there are no used electric vehicles.
Sure there are. Absolutely there are. There are lots of ones coming off lease, but people are buying them. I traded in one recently and bought a brand new electric Toyota SUV, electric, pure. And my old one has been sitting there for 4 months. No offers. So yeah, there are options out there. I mean, people can also do solar on their homes, which is what I'm a strong proponent of, and I've done a lot of them myself, projects. But there are barriers. Where I live right now in Sun Rivers, we're actually under Corex, that's our utility company. Corex buys from BC Hydro and resells it to us. Corex is now prohibiting any new solar in Sun Rivers. There's only about 5 or 6 solar arrays in the entire community, but they've decided, because they don't want to lose any profit from the energy that they would lose selling, to prevent it going forward. So, you know, we have policy barriers, we have individual barriers, we have psychological barriers, financial in some cases. Makes it very hard to transition out of this cycle and to break all of these things that I've been mentioning.
You've been watching The Crisis Storm from Mastermind Studios in association with AIMCanada Mentorship Society. Today we've been talking to Michael Mehta from Thompson Rivers University's Sociology Department. We'll be right back to wrap things up in the final piece of our discussion with Michael.
We live in a world of conversations about life and survival. On a daily basis, mankind continually seeks a way to make our human experience better on all levels. We seek a way forward. Permit me to invite you to one of such conversations happening right here in Kamloops. AIMCanada Mentorship Society and Mastermind Studios are putting together a special fundraising dinner towards the production of a documentary film series titled Finding a Way Forward. The documentary series will periscope the crisis storm in our community, including homelessness, mental health, drug overdose, crime, and communication breakdown. Guest speaker is the Executive Director of the Canadian Mental Health Association in Kamloops, Mr. Alfred Achoba. Music will be provided by the virtuoso himself, Jeremy Nishaw. You will also witness a thought-provoking art installation titled Not All Dolls Live in Houses, from the talented Isa Jessica Jordan. Don't miss out on the mouth-watering dinner, which will be a Greek buffet with vegan options and lots of refreshments to nourish us. Bring your family, neighbors, bring your friends to this fundraising dinner in support of community mentorship and the development of a Kamloops-focused documentary film series to find a way forward.
On the 23rd of February 2024, a prestigious event will be held. AIMCanada Mentorship Society and Mastermind Studios are putting together a special fundraising dinner towards the production of a special documentary film series titled Finding a Way Forward. To get tickets, go to www.findingawayforward.com. Have you ever considered launching a professional video podcast? Or creating a video-based interview, but felt daunted by the task? You may have wondered how to begin, how many cameras you need, who to interview, what to say, what kind of film set do you need, lighting, sound, what editing to use, and how to attract viewers or listeners. Did you know that Mastermind Studios can produce 4 to 8 video podcast shows in a single day, complete with recording, editing, and distribution? Contact us now for your free consultation. Let's explore the possibilities. We can work together to turn your maybe into a resounding yes. Give me a call. mastermindstudios.ca. Give us a call right now. 250-574-6902. From a sociological standpoint, let's talk just a little bit about what does healthy communication between people look like?
Looks like what we're doing. It's honest, face-to-face dialogue, true interest in learning about the other person's perspectives, active listening, not being offended by what other people say, being willing to change your opinion when you hear something that maybe makes you think about something differently. I mean, digging your heels in and sticking with what you believe initially isn't necessarily a healthy thing to do. I mean, we're pretty fluid plastic people. We're always changing based upon who we're around. And, throughout our life cycle, we change our views a lot. Sometimes we get a little bit channeled and we get a little hardened in our worldviews. Unfortunately, one of the challenges of aging is that you tend to become a little bit more hardened, a little less flexible. A lot of people in general do. They also tend to become a little bit more conservative, relatively speaking. So that's an issue with an aging population that we've got in Canada, with boomer population.
We do still see the digging in of heels with younger generations, though. Why do we go there?
Why do we go where?
Why do we dig our heels in and not allow ourselves to ask the right questions and allow our minds to be changed? Why don't we do that?
I don't think there's one answer to that. I think one of the reasons is that people perhaps feel that they're so invested in their own individual perspective because they package it, or it's packaged for them ideologically. It's all wrapped up. So, for example, if you're politically conservative, and I have lots of friends that are, and colleagues that are as well, that you tend to see the world a little bit differently. Not because of your politics, but because you've been told that these things need to go together. That's manufactured. That is how we're allowing politicians and political parties in particular to set the agenda on our thinking and the bounds of our thinking. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from people lately that are conservative and perhaps fundamentalist in terms of their Christianity, talking about all of these issues around sexual identity and gender. It's a constant thing. I hear it almost daily from people, and it's sad because it is a reality and it is something that is changing, and there are a lot of people that are left, affected by this. Yet there are many people that now believe that this is something that we shouldn't allow to happen. We shouldn't allow it to be taught in schools. We shouldn't support people, and on and on and on. And a lot of that is because it's been politically packaged for specific ideological purposes. That's the shortcut.
It's not what they're saying, but it's the political manipulation that's happening as a result of what they're saying.
Yeah, it's the wedge issues. These parties that are very polarizing in society to begin with are finding their wedge issues, and they're creating their audiences according to them and packaging them together into a set of beliefs that they believe are coherent and consistent. And that's how people get their heels dug in. Yeah.
And so again, to protect ourselves from that, we just have to keep our minds open and surround ourselves with like-minded people, or is there another strategy?
Well, I actually don't think you should surround yourself with like-minded people. I think you should deliberately go out of your way to find people that see the world differently from you.
Okay.
If you
Tell me more about that. 'Cause,
Yeah.
I mean, that's, for most people, that is at best, emotional draining
Yes,
practice.
it is.
And at worst, an identity threatening practice.
Well, I don't see it as identity threatening. I definitely know it takes more work, and it can be taxing. There's no question about it. But we know when you meet people from other walks of life who have different views, if you listen to them, as I said, actively and with compassion and with true interest in what they're saying, it's not about listening to them and experiencing them as a person that's going to threaten your identity and your belief systems. It's that you're trying to find common ground. I think when we do that, we're going to find more common ground between us than things that separate us. And I try to do that a lot. It is difficult in Kamloops, I'll have to say, as a professor, to be very honest about it. When I go out into public places, I never tell people what I do, because they have a certain bias already, and they think that you're judging them perhaps, or that you're assessing their English. I make more split infinitives than almost anybody. But they think I'm, judging their grammar and spelling and whatever else they do. And they feel maybe a little threatened by it. So I never tell them what I do. But the funny thing is that people can tell what you're, generally speaking, where you come from in society. Because in sociology, one of the things that we've talked about for decades in the literature and in practice is something called the hidden injuries of class. There are a lot of different ways in which people are treated differently based upon their social positions. And they may seem to look like, these things are bouncing off from the slights and the ways that people look at them, the way perhaps they're treated if they dress differently. But they're hidden injuries nonetheless. These are problems. These are ways that we have to sort of create things that can help heal these rifts. And again, by being around people with different perspectives and different experiences, lived experiences, you're going to be stronger as a result. You're going to be more resilient.
As you're talking, I'm envisioning, what a world could look like. Sci-fi fan?
Oh yeah, of course, of course.
Good.
Not the dystopian stuff, although I do like a little bit of Mad Max and stuff like that once in a while.
Right.
Yeah.
It's often a battle in the studio here, Star Trek versus Star Wars.
Of course, yeah.
And Star Wars usually wins. But I will say that, Gene Rodenberry paints a pretty incredible picture of the future, or what the future in his perspective could look like. With the world that, might be in the 24th century as he envisioned it. But is that, do you think, a possibility for society to live in that utopian type of world in the future?
Yes and no. Not with our current population, not with the environmental constraints that we face and the resource issues that we face. I think that those themselves are going to prevent us from moving in that direction, because invariably they will create conflicts and competition. And again, this brings us back to that earlier topic about how all this is being manifested in terms of mental health, physical health, as well as political discourse that we have. In a much smaller world with a smaller population and all the other things that are taken care of, presumably a stable world ecologically, absolutely. But I see the instability and all the chaos and the decline of things like biodiversity, increases in air pollution, all of these issues as really preventing us from going down that road.
Yeah. Smaller population, how?
I don't know. I hope it's not that reckoning that I was mentioning earlier that moves us in that direction. People do need to be aware that if you're a Western person and you live like a Westerner, and your ecological footprint is 5 to 10 times higher than larger than anywhere else on the planet, that you have to have less children, and you have to be very careful about our resources. It's tricky in a country like Canada. Look at water. We are one of the most wasteful of societies on the planet with water, using 200-300 liters of water per person per day. and been able to get away with that to a certain extent because of our smaller population and large amount of fresh water. But that's definitely changing as groundwater resources dry up and other resources become compromised. So that's where I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, Peter, how historically ecological constraints and resource constraints lead to societal change. Sometimes it leads to collapse of those societies. Yeah.
I would love to leave people off with something constructive. And
Something happy.
so, well, it doesn't have to be something happy, Michael. But
I do have some solutions.
tell me about that,
Okay.
because I think that's where we need to go. I think a lot of what people are feeling today is not apathy. It is fatigue around all of these issues. Compassion fatigue, physical fatigue, emotional fatigue, mental fatigue. People are frustrated, and that leads to them being upset, which leads to the polarization and everything else. And my hope with the crisis storm and these conversations that we've been having is that not only can we have good conversation and better understand these crises, but to also learn of what we can do, solutions that we can move towards together. So
Yeah.
give me your thoughts there.
Sure. So I think we do have, luckily, a lot of things in our culture, and other cultures do as well, that allow us to heal. And there are things that we tend not to think of as valuable that way, but we all know that they can do these things. And so, for instance, music, which I'm a very firm believer in as a healing agent, as a way of bonding us together, is extremely powerful. Not just listening to music, I think that's important, that's part of it, but creating it and being part of that creative process. I'm always shocked when I ask my students, and I have hundreds a year, 300 on average usually, how many perform, how many play an instrument. Less than a handful across the 300. I'm always shocked by that. And you look at historically societies that have good social bonds and that are tight and that work together well, that are cohesive. There are many people in those societies that are involved in music and the arts and more generally in those sort of curative things. I think we've lost a lot of that. So I'm a firm believer that that's something that we have to really sort of push. Secondly, I have the pleasure this year of creating a first of its kind course at the university at TRU on the sociology of comedy and humor, where my students are actually learning, and me as well, about humor and how it could be used in a variety of ways. We're discussing a lot the challenges with it, especially around race-based humor or gender-based humor, some of the issues there. And they're actually workshopping it every week. And coming up in a few weeks, they have their first show where publicly they're going to perform their skits and their stand-up routines and everything else. And I found that by teaching that course, that the students are coming them out of their shells. A lot of them took it not because they were humorous or had any skills. They took it because they were looking for a cure. They were looking for a different way to see the world and how to act in that world, to use humor, to diffuse anger and tension in the workplace perhaps, as am I. So I think that that's a lost art.
You just blew me away with the whole comedy thing as a course and as a learning mechanism.
Yes.
If people want to, is this something that's open for the public to go and see these students?
It sure is, yeah. So if could I put a plug in?
Please.
Well, yes, so it's a free event. It's being held at the Pizza Pie Restaurant at 314 Victoria Street in downtown Kamloops on November 23rd, starting at 7. So the students are going to showcase their work, and people are welcome to come up and do a little routine on their own if they want to. We're going to make it participatory.
How many students?
There's 33 in the class right now.
That are all participating in presenting this?
Most of them are going to be presenting, doing parts of it. Some of them are involved in logistics and marketing and technical side of it. They're learning all those different skills.
And how many seats for the public. Are there in Pizza Pie?
Yeah, so I believe it'll sit 60, but there's room for more people to stand.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, and it's not the only solution. Music and humor are really important, but what they sort of point us towards is the need to reconnect with things that are that go beyond the work environment, that go beyond simply sitting at home and sitting on the computer or your cell phone. Working with people, producing music together collaboratively is incredibly restorative. Understanding what makes something funny is also very important because, I think if we were too serious about all these issues, and it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole and to get lost in that anxiety, as I mentioned. If you're too serious and you don't understand how to put it in context, it's going to just be insufferable. So these are just some of the ways that people can cope. I think we need a revival of hobbies and crafts, more people doing things like knitting and quilting. And these aren't just generational things. I think they need to be revived. Painting. Layer all of that together on top of all that civil society stuff that I mentioned earlier. Once people start doing these things again, they're going to be more likely to participate in civil society and to want to work together as well. So I do see this as a major thing.
Thank you. Before we close, any additional final thoughts? I thank you for that. It's not something that I had considered and looked at in that vein. You've opened my mind to a few possibilities that perhaps give us a little bit more hope.
Right. I guess the last sort of point, Peter, is the importance of reconnecting with nature. Again, we live in very artificially manufactured worlds, online, but also in our homes that are, protect us and prevent us from being in touch with nature. Going out and spending time in nature, even if it's just simply hiking or biking, getting out of your car, is incredibly restorative as well. I think all of these things are strategies that have been proven effective since the dawn of time for our species, and we've forgotten them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's a lot of wisdom for people to unpack in some of what you've said. You've been watching The Crisis Storm from Mastermind Studios and AIMCanada Mentorship Society, and you've been listening to Dr. Michael Mehta from Thompson Rivers University's Sociology Department. Thanks for watching. We look forward to seeing you next time on The Crisis Storm.